So welcome everyone to this webinar on financing the future, scaling quality and equitable early childhood education. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us today from around the world. My name is Diane Coury. I am a senior program specialist at the UNESCO International Institute for Education Planning, or IIEP. IIEP is one of UNESCO's 8 specialized institutes established in 1962 with a dedicated mandate to strengthen the capacity of UNESCO member states to plan and manage their education systems. Along with education sector analysis and planning, early childhood education is one of my focus areas at IIEP and in my work with ministries of education. I also had the pleasure of co-designing and delivering the early childhood education course at IIEP's Global Campus, which today's webinar is part of. But before we kick off the webinar, I'd like to share some housekeeping notes with you. You see that there is a chat that is open, and we encourage you to use the chat to communicate with the other webinar participants. Please feel free to share your names, organization, what city you're joining the webinar from, and maybe a sentence on what brought you here today, what motivated you to learn more about ECE financing. We will have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience only after the first part of the webinar. If you have any question you would like to pose, please share them in the chat. They will be passed to the speakers. Today's webinar is being recorded. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the recording and the speaker slides. Over the course of the webinar, we will also share in the chat a list of publications and websites for additional information on the topics discussed during the webinar. They will also be available after the session on the event page. Now, allow me to introduce Dr. Ozsel Beleli, who will be moderating this webinar with me. Dr. Beleli is the head of learning and engagement at the Education Outcomes Fund. She's been working at the intersection of research and policy for close to 20 years, with a focus on early years and basic education. She's originally from Turkey and is joining the webinar today from Washington, D.C. Important to mention here, EOF, together with UNESCO headquarters, have been partnering with us to deliver the course on ECE mainstreaming into planning. Over to you, Ozsel.
Thank you, Diane, for your warm introduction. And thank you and all your colleagues at IEP, especially Hannah, Laura, Ella, and Elizabeth, for what's been a wonderful collaboration over the past 18 months now, both for the course on early childhood education planning and also for today's webinar. And good morning from a very warm and sunny morning here in Washington, D.C. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers, our course participants, and those of you who decided to take an hour and a half from your busy schedules to learn about the challenges and opportunities for financing quality early childhood education at scale. So when we originally started planning this webinar, we thought it would be a small closed discussion between 2-3 guest speakers and the participants of the early childhood education planning course. I'd like to thank our IEP colleagues for suggesting the idea of a public webinar. Over 750 people registered for the webinar, and if I'm seeing the numbers right on the screen right now, we have 217 ECE champions joining this webinar to learn from each other. To me, this shows that there's great interest and momentum for finding better answers to 2 problems that are keeping many of us awake at night and working hard during the daylight hours. The first question is, how can we secure more financial resources for expanding early learning opportunities to reach more children? And the second question is, how can we use these financial resources more effectively so the ECE services provided are of better quality and are pro-equity? So thank you to each and every one of you joining us today for the great work that you do to advocate for and to create learning opportunities for young children, to make sure that every young child has access to quality early education opportunities. Before we turn to our speakers, Diane and I would like to share some of the reasons why we, that is both EOF and IEP, but also Diane and Ozsel as 2 ECE champions inside our organizations, why we wanted to organize this webinar and why we wanted to put a spotlight on financing for quality and equitable early childhood education. So back to you, Diane.
Thanks so much, Ozsel. Yeah, indeed, in today's context of growing uncertainty and tighter resources, planning matters more than ever. Education systems are being asked to do more with less, and this is exactly why education sector plans, or ESP, are so important. They provide a shared national vision, but they also do something very practical. They turn priorities into strategies, activities, and targets. They help governments and partners align and prioritize around the system's main challenges and around the choices needed to address them. This is also why ISP partnership with Ministry of Education on ESPs is so relevant. Our role is to support ministries in strengthening their capacity to plan, manage, and finance education systems in ways that are evidence-based, realistic, and aligned with national priorities. Good planning is not only about ambition, it is also making informed and strategic choices, including around the allocation of time and resources. This is particularly important for early childhood education. Despite strong global commitments and clear evidence of its importance, ECE is still too often treated as an optional rather than foundational. It was also not sufficiently reflected in sector analysis, nor always or adequately costed, nor given enough visibility in budgets and financing frameworks. It is also too often left without the level of public financing needed for sustainable implementation. That is why integrating ECE into ESPs is essential. When ECE is properly embedded in sector plans, it is more likely to be recognized as a core part of the education system and not as an add-on. And if we want ECE policies to be implemented, we also need to think much more strategically about financing. ECE cannot remain visible in policy discourse, but invisible in budgets. Its costs need to be clearly identified and linked to implementation, timelines, and responsibilities. That is why both this course on mainstreaming ECE into education sector planning and this webinar on financing quality ECE are part of our broader effort to support civil servants in Ministry of Education to develop robust, realistic, and adequately funded ECE policies. Thank you. Over to you, Ozsel.
Thank you, Dan. And if I could add two things to Dan's excellent points on the importance of mainstreaming early childhood education into education sector planning. So at the Education Outcomes Fund, we partner with governments and donors to support their efforts to ensure that there's adequate funding for early childhood education. However, we insist that our efforts do not stop at getting more funding for ECE. We have to think and do more to ensure that the funding that we have is spent more effectively. So children who attend ECE are learning and developing, that it's spent more efficiently. So every lira, every dollar, every rand goes further, and that is spent more equitably. So the children, young children from disadvantaged families who are behind in their development are prioritized. And here I'll borrow a term from my son who went to kindergarten in Washington, D.C. The term is easy peasy. So adequate, effective, efficient, equitable financing for early childhood education is not easy peasy. And because it's not easy peasy, and in fact, it is rather complex and challenging, is exactly why it's important for us to come together, to talk about it, to share and learn from each other, and also to give each other courage and support, knowing we're in this together. That is exactly what the participants of the Early Childhood Education Planning course are doing over an 8-week period. They're reading, reflecting, discussing together. They're sharing and learning from each other and building relationships that we hope will last for many years so that they continue to support each other in advancing access to quality early childhood education in their countries. And that is also why we're here today in this webinar, hearing from policymakers, researchers, practitioners, advocates to learn from their experiences, successes, and failures, and also to remind ourselves that there are many early childhood education champions in our countries, in our regions, and around the world that we can connect with and collaborate with. So now you can see the agenda. There will be 2 sessions today. The first session will focus on domestic financing. We will hear from Dr. Kotzé about her learnings from mobilizing and deploying domestic funding for early childhood education in South Africa. We will also hear from Dr. Neuman about broader lessons from other countries on leveraging domestic funding resources and using them for quality ECE. During the second session, we'll shift our focus to international resources, global efforts, and partnerships that civil servants in ministries of education and civil society organizations can leverage in their efforts to scale quality ECE in their countries. We'll be hearing from Rokhaya Diawara from UNESCO, Melissa Kelly from the World Bank, and from Adriana Balducci from the Education Outcomes Fund. We'll then be turning to GC Chang from UNESCO and Diane for their closing remarks. So without further ado, let's kick off the first section of the webinar and turn to Dr. Kotzé and Dr. Neuman. Dr. Kotzé is the Director for Early Childhood Development at the Department of Basic Education of South Africa. She is responsible for leading the system reforms to achieve universal access to quality early learning programs. She's also one of the co-orchestrators, and I love this word, of an ecosystem-wide initiative, Bana Pele, Children First, for the expansion of quality early learning in South Africa. And thank you, Janeli, for joining us today. And Dr. Neuman is a senior fellow at Results for Development. She works with governments and global partners to improve young children's development. From 2023 to 25, as a Federation of American Scientists Impact Fellow embedded in USA, she led the design and implementation of many play-based early childhood programs. Her recent research has focused on financing early childhood education. She is the co-author of a recent UNESCO paper on sustained and transformative financing for early childhood care and education. And thank you, Michelle, for being here today. And over to you, Janeli, to share with us about how the Department of Basic Education has approached the challenge of financing the scaling of early childhood education in South Africa. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it. Yes, as I think many have heard, in early childhood development in South Africa, we've been gaining a lot of momentum. And today I want to share some of the good stories, but also of the lessons we've been learning through this journey over the last couple of years. In 2022, the Department of Basic Education in South Africa became responsible for early childhood development. It focuses specifically on the early learning part of it, but we're also responsible for coordinating the holistic side of early childhood development. And at that point, we developed a strategy. We're calling it the 2030 Strategy for ECD programs, where we said it's important that as a country that we have a shared vision and mission for children. And we articulate that as saying that we want universal access to quality early childhood development, prioritizing the most vulnerable children. And we said in the way that we should do that is what we call a social compact way, where the whole of society comes around children, comes around families and communities to make sure that each child have access to quality early childhood development. We said that there's multiple players that's already doing a lot of work in the sector, and we need to see how can we best get them to play their roles best. As government, we are responsible for setting quality standards, for subsidizing the function, for regulating the function. ECD programs are provided 99% by independent providers, micro enterprises, and women in their communities that started these ECD programs, as we call them, and that can receive government subsidies. We've got many civil society organizations, non-profit organizations that have been historically been supporting women and these micro enterprises, and we need to continuously working with them in collaboration. And then we've got donors and private sector who has historically been funding our implementing partners, and we need to collaborate with them because government in itself will never be able to fund everything. And that is where the social compact have come on board, and that is where the movement Bana Pele started. Bana Pele in South Africa, or in Sesotho, means putting children first. And that is what we are uniting as a country around, is how can we, in everything we do, put children first. We had a leadership summit at the start of last year where we brought leaders together from business, from civil society, from the sector, and we set various goals for ourselves. So collectively, we'll own these goals. We want to expand access. For us, that means another 250,000 children by 2027 and 950 more children between 2027 and 2030. We want to raise the quality, and we've got what we call the Thrive by 5 index, where we're measuring 4-year-olds, where we said we want to increase the green, we want more children developmentally on track, and reduce the rate. We want fewer children to be falling far behind their developmental milestones. And to do that, we need to resource the sector much better. We need to mobilize funding, both financial and non-financial resources, to help us target the scale up, and we need to have enabling government systems that are transparent, responsive, and integrated, that can really serve as the backbone for early learning support networks. When we double click on resourcing the sector, we realize we need what we call a funding stack. As government, we will never be able to fund the investment required to increase access and improve quality. But as the government, we are responsible for the financial sustainability of the ECD sector. So what we said as government is we need to make sure that we can at least fund the operational cost of ECD programs, the day-to-day costs that they need to. And we've come up with a financing strategy on how can we systematically over time increase our funding so that we can cover the operational costs. But a lot of investment, once-off investment is needed. And that is where the public-private funding stack comes in. The first is what we're calling in general an intermediary fund for delivery. And we're currently working with the Education Outcomes Fund on our first early childhood education outcomes fund for South Africa, where it's our first phase, our test phase of how does this public-private funding mechanism work, where we invest in improving outcomes and increasing access. And we've contracted 5 implementing partners that are now helping us with increasing access and improving quality in 3 of our provinces across the country. Also need a lot of infrastructure investment. Again, as government, we've got a pocket of funding that goes to the maintenance required to upgrade ECD programs, but it's not sufficient. And as government, we can't provide maintenance support or infrastructure support to privately owned ECD programs. And that's why the private sector has been important. And there's a private sector fund where donors have come together. So how can they invest in supporting the expansion of access to safe spaces that's conducive for early learning? And then we know, and this is a new piece of work that we're busy working on, is if we need to create another 1.2 million spaces for children, it means we need another roughly 150,000 ECD practitioners. And to have that pipeline, we need to have a startup package of support. And we again trying to see how can we have a public-private type of fund or a way of working together so that we can stimulate the expansion of access by having startup funding available for ECD programs. But we had some momentum already. In the previous year, the 2025 budget speech by our Minister of Finance, we got an investment of 10 billion rand across 3 years. And a lot of questions have been asked on how have you managed to get this increased government investment in ECD? And I think there was a couple of key ingredients in this. I think in South Africa, we had quite a unique moment, quite a unique political moment. The function of ECD shifted from one government department to the next, and that brought more momentum, that brought more visibility of this. And we have a president at this point that fully understands the importance of early childhood development, has really leaned into providing his support to the momentum here. We also have a minister that has been reorientating the education sector to focus on foundational learning and has been putting a lot of energy around that. So there was, I think we had quite a unique political moment at that point. We also had to build a very strong business case for National Treasury. We had a strong investment case that we had for early childhood development, and I think all countries have that. We all understand the importance of investing in children in the long run and for investing in women and the care economy in the short run. So there's that narrative that we've been building on why it's important to invest in early childhood education. And we supported that with a very robust financial model where we worked with actuaries to help us with population modeling and understanding what is needed what is the access gap, and how do we start systematically over the next 10 years increase investment in a way that we can get to that point of covering all operational costs. That had to build on strong quantitative evidence. In 2020, it was during COVID, we did a census of all ECD programs. We had people literally walking the streets, finding ECD programs, mapping them, and building our first master list of all ECD program providers. Because they're all independent, we didn't know where they are, and we had to understand what does supply look like so that we understand what the access gap is. We did the Thrive by 5 Index, which is a nationally representative sample of child outcomes of 4 and 5-year-olds to help us understand, are children on track? Do we have the child outcomes that we want to see? We didn't, but it helped us start building that case that we need to start improving and investing so we can improve child outcomes. And the World Bank supported us with the public expenditure and institutional review, which again just helped us understand what funding is currently being allocated where in the early childhood development space and how can we leverage it more strategically. Then we know, and Treasury, in our engagement with National Treasury, there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that we still need to build and we're currently building. We need to have more accountability and transparency in our systems. And that's why we started building a management information and system. And we're calling it ECARES, which is the Early Childhood Administration and Reporting System. We needed to start digitizing our business processes, moving from paper-based to digital processes so that there's, again, transparency and accountability. And all of this is helping us with that credibility that National Treasury wanted so that we can start building this investment from a government perspective. What I didn't realize as I was celebrating this investment we received is what is it going to take to spend the money? I think we've been for years focusing so much on we need more investment in South Africa. When the funding landed, we realized you need to be very careful what you wish for, because now we have to spend that funding. And anyone sitting in a government department understands that if you don't spend your funding, you will lose it and you won't get it back again. And that is part of this process of accountability. And why it's difficult to spend money is that you've got a regulatory framework that you need to work in. In South Africa, we've got a Public Finance and Management Act that regulates how public officials and public institutions need to spend money. We also have a Children's Act has additional regulations on who can receive money. So in our case, only ECD programs that are conditionally registered with the department can receive funding. For them to get conditionally registered, they need to be compliant. So they need to be able to invest in the infrastructure and health and safety to become registered to receive funding, which means we need this pipeline of eligible ECD programs need to be ready to be able to receive funding. And what we realize is we essentially have this poverty trap happening in South Africa where ECD programs need funding support so that they can invest in infrastructure because they need to be registered to access funding, which means they need to be able to meet the norms and standards to get registered. They need funding to invest in their infrastructure. So because they're not getting any government support, they get stuck. And the poorest and most vulnerable ECD programs are getting stuck. So while we have money, we can't get it to them because they're not registered. And I think this is some of the complexities that I think often government officials are struggling with is even if you have money, it's very difficult to actually spend that money in a responsible way. And we need to have creative thinking in that sense. And that is where we said, okay, well, to spend this money, let's try think outside of the box. Let's offer a once-off cash transfer to ECD programs to help them do this investment required so that they can get registered. But again, there's a whole array of challenges that we need to think through. ECD programs don't always have bank accounts in South Africa. So how do we work with our big banks to start having bank accounts? We need to sign a contract with each of these ECD programs because they're receiving government money. And what does the application process and signature process look like for them? And then we need government payment systems to be able to pay ECD programs. And a requirement that our government has is that ECD programs have to be on a central supplier database, which means they need to be tax registered. So be careful what you wish for. And I think that is the lesson we've learned, is that if you do ask for a lot of funding, be careful in understanding what are those mechanisms that you will need to put in place to be able to spend the money, and what is those pipelines that you need to put in place. And I think that is why public-private partnerships have been so particularly helpful for us. While we need to advocate for increased funding in ECD continuously, we also need to think strategically on what type of funding is most appropriate for which type of problems that we want to solve for. Donors and philanthropic funding they've got a lot of flexibility. That's their asset. That's their strength. They can invest in projects or areas that government sometimes can't. But they don't, it's not necessarily sustainable, and therefore you can't really rely on them for operational costs. That is where the government's sustainability needs to come in. Outcomes funds are really innovative mechanisms to co-fund between government and the private sector, and we've seen it work brilliantly in South Africa, but it can sometimes be expensive. There's a lot of administrative costs and evaluation costs, and I think as we're thinking of integrating outcomes fund in our long run strategy, we're really wrestling with how do we bring this in a way in which we can really ensure that this mechanism, that the majority of the funding actually goes to children in the end. And then government is your old and faithful car. It takes long, it's rigid, and it's sometimes difficult to spend the money, but it's sustainable. And that is the strength we bring into the sector. So I think as countries think through and grapple with how they bring their funding together, it's helpful to think of who are the different actors, what are the different mechanisms, and what are the strengths of each, and then use it strategically to fill that gap that speak to its strength. Thank you. I hope this has been helpful.
This has been tremendously helpful. Thank you, Janeli, for both the work that you lead and also the willingness to share the challenges so openly. And I think this is so valuable for all ECE champions to be able to learn quicker from each other and to go further faster in scaling quality ECE. And before I turn to Michelle, just a quick reminder, if you have a question you would like to pose to Janeli or Michelle, please do share it in the chat. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll try our best. So keep the questions coming. I already saw a few of them coming in. So with that, over to you, Michelle. I'm very curious to hear your reflections. So when you hear the various financial instruments and funding streams Department of Basic Education has been able to leverage in South Africa, in your research, you've looked at experiences of many different countries from both Sub-Saharan Africa and different regions to identify patterns and also distill some insights for policymakers. How does South Africa's experience compare to some of the countries that you've studied?
Yeah, I'm happy to try to answer that question. But first of all, it's so exciting to hear the momentum in South Africa, as well as some of the hurdles and some really creative ways to overcome them. So I'm going to pick up on a few themes from Janeli's presentation, and I'll try to put them in a broader context and highlight some examples from other parts of the world. I'm going to focus on 3 financing-related trends, so I'm going to put them in the chat. So the first one is around universal access that prioritizes vulnerable children, and that really is the approach taken in South Africa. I think it was the first slide. And it means that the government is becoming the main driver and the main funder in terms of operational costs, but at the same time, not necessarily the main provider. And so that's the importance of building partnerships to really expand that network to meet all the needs of all children. But it also means that we need to use financing models like per capita grants and block grants to address some of the existing disparities in terms of access and affordability and quality. So we're seeing countries that are really being thoughtful about how to design financing mechanisms that are targeting resources based on indicators like socioeconomic background, disability status, school location, size, in order to get the resources to improve equity and inclusion. And this does make a difference. There's some data coming out of the OECD countries that show that when you subsidize fees for parents of specific populations, like for low-income families, those countries have higher participation rates, like 13 percentage points higher than those that aren't doing subsidies in that way. But there are 2 notes of caution. So first, you have to take into account the quality of provision, and this also came out in the remarks about South Africa. And it can be quite challenging both to determine, what does quality cost? And so how do we help make sure that resources are covering it, but also quality, does probably cost maybe more than the government has to fund. And so how do you ensure that there are adequate resources to cover the cost of quality? We're also seeing that, and this is my second caution, is that, despite strong efforts, some of these subsidies aren't reaching eligible children, either because there isn't enough funding to go around or due to other reasons. And I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. But first, a couple of examples. So Brazil, early childhood education is treated as a public good. It's compulsory for 4 to 6-year-olds. The financing is primarily public, though it is decentralized and shared across municipalities, states, and the federal government. In order to help equalize funding, there's a National Education Fund that complements funding. So it takes the taxes from state and municipalities and redistributes them so that it can help address the regional and socioeconomic inequalities and the resources that are available to support early childhood education. Another example is from Indonesia, which still has a long way to go to reach universal access, but it is using its government funds to fund registered ECE centers to cover their operational costs. And we heard about how important that is. So, and then more funding goes to centers that are serving poor students or students with disabilities or those facing emergencies in order to promote equity. So those are just two of many examples that I could highlight. But I want to move on to the second theme that we're seeing, which is around the shift from financing services to financing systems. And this is really about scale. So some of you might be familiar with Hiro Yoshikawa's work where he talks about two kinds of scale, small to bigger and big to better. So, most governments focus on trying to reach more children. So that's small to bigger. But it's just as important to make sure that you are strengthening the systems as access expands to make sure that we have the quality and equity that are our system-wide goals. So that's the big to better. What's the infrastructure that needs to support the service delivery? And again, South Africa shows this support for this system-wide approach, looking at policies and legal frameworks, intersectoral coordination, workforce development, quality assurance, using data. All of those things are super important. So I'm going to highlight two examples of this trend. So Morocco has worked really thoughtfully across different sectors as part of the national initiative to support human development. And preschool enrollment has almost doubled since 2018 across the country. So from 45% to 80%. And in rural areas, which has been a real priority, it has tripled. So how has this happened? It's been very intentional. There was a costing study, and we heard about how data is very important to figure out what are the financial implications of trying to achieve universal preschool. There's a strong legal framework that prioritizes children's access in rural and disadvantaged areas, as well as for girls and children with disabilities. And the government also invests in quality. So that's primarily focused on training educators, but also standards and quality assurance. So again, across the system, looking at how the different pieces come together in a sustainable, equitable way. And then in another part of the world, in Ireland, there's the First Five strategy, which I find super interesting. It's a whole of government approach that starts prenatally, go through age 5, through the early years. One of the things they've done is they had kind of a messy system of different financing streams, and they pulled them together in a more coordinated way and are transitioning from a system that was mostly market-based to one that's primarily publicly funded. But it's building off the provision that's already there. And we've heard how important it is to look at what's currently in place. So the government also has a tiered subsidy approach that combines the universal and targeted financing, and they have core funding that goes to providers. They put fee freezes so that parents' fees don't increase, but they've also made sure that there's funding coming in so that the pay for early childhood workers can increase over time. And that helps create more sustainable financing for services. So I'm going to quickly go to the third trend that we're seeing. Now, I'll acknowledge that this is more of an emerging trend, but it's addressing direct and indirect barriers to access. So we typically think about what are the main barriers? It's affordability, it's accessibility, it's availability of services. But there are also indirect barriers. We heard about administrative challenges, getting the money to the providers. Well, what about from the family side? Are they reluctant to maybe enroll their children? Are there language barriers? Are there complex application processes? So that's why we're also seeing disparities in enrollment, even in countries that guarantee a place. And the OECD has a really good report that talks about some of these direct and indirect barriers. So for example, there's a study in Germany that looks at one part of the country, and it shows how small changes can make a big difference. So what they did is they provided more information about how to apply for a childcare space. And then they also had a trained expert come in and provide support to families so that they better understood how to apply for a spot for their child. And they found that basically closed the enrollment gap across socioeconomic groups. So again, the resources were there, but you needed other things in place to make the most of it. And then finally, New Zealand, it takes a two-pronged approach to address both the direct barriers. So they give more funding to low-income and isolated communities or services serving children from minority backgrounds to help pay for the extra costs, whether that's staffing or curriculum or other aspects of quality. But they also address the indirect barriers. So they have a program called Engaging Families, and it works with community-based organizations that reach out to underrepresented families, whether those are minority or immigrant families or other underrepresented groups. And it tries to better understand why are children not enrolled in early childhood education settings. And it helps provide them with guidance and support about what these services provide and how they can perhaps better meet the needs and find services that are good and suitable for their families. So I'll stop there, but I really look forward to your reactions and comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. As you're talking, I'm like taking notes of all these case studies, models. I was like, got to do more research, got to do more reading. So thanks so much. Really appreciate the comparative insights and the various examples from your research. And for those of you who would like to do a deeper dive into these issues and country cases, among the list of resources that our colleagues have shared in the chat, you can find a link to the report that Michelle co-authored on ECCE financing. Before we start the Q&A, and I see many questions coming in, which is very exciting. Janeli, can I actually come back to you for a couple of minutes? So Michelle highlighted the importance and the challenge of making financing work for quality and equity and making sure various issues on the supply side and demand side are also addressed around this. Do these experiences, insights, challenges from other countries resonate with your ongoing efforts in South Africa? How are you approaching both the quality and the equity challenge? What is proving successful and what is turning out to be much harder than you thought it would be?
Yeah. Yes, and I think this is always a tension that we face in. If we look at primary education, we always critique that expansion happened without quality, and now you sit in ECD and like, I'm not going to make the same mistake. But what we've seen, for instance, when we did our Thrive by 5, we did a subsample where we assessed 4-year-olds that are not accessing ECD programs. And it's not representative, but within like a poor ward, we saw that children accessing ECD programs, even of the poorest quality, already was 5 to 7 months ahead in certain child outcomes like language and literacy development. So by the mere fact of accessing ECD programs, you're already working to improve child outcomes. But then we know quality will always be a journey. And I think that's how we've started looking at this quality access tension. Is you can't improve quality of something that doesn't exist. But it's always parallel streams. Is how do you help establish a new ECD program and then take that practitioner on this quality journey? But yes, costing it is tricky because improving quality can have multiple steps, and we all want coaching, but coaching is really expensive. So I think these are some of the things we are still wrestling with, as we don't have the answers with. But how do you build an ecosystem where quality is enhanced, but where you're not constrained by resources, because funding will always be a constraint. So a lot of innovation needs to happen on that end still.
Thank you. And I'm keeping the quality as a journey and the quality access tension as two framings that I think is worth thinking more about in various country contexts. So thank you for flagging those also. So we now actually have about 20 minutes for the many questions that we're receiving, but I am going to use my privileges as a moderator to ask the first question to Janeli. And because I personally think in our collective learning exercises, when we come together in webinars like this or panels, we focus so much on the good practices and the best practices, the good practices, and not necessarily enough on our mistakes and the shortcomings. So, which I think does contribute to the similar mistakes being repeated across different contexts. This being the motivation, I'd like to ask you, Janeli, what was the biggest mistake that you made in your role as a director for early childhood development at the Department of Basic Education?
Yes, many. But I think especially when we think of the financing side, I think the big thing I'm reflecting on is we build a very strong case for funding. And we were so focused on getting more funding into the sector, we forgot to look at the longer run picture of, okay, but will we be able to spend this funding? Do we have this pipeline? So it felt to me we looked at the mountain from the one end, but we didn't actually look at the runway needed. And I think in the next time, recognizing that you need to ask for funding and be able to spend that funding. And that is two parallel business processes that need to happen and intersect at some stage. I think next time we'll be a little bit more realistic on not only what do we need, but what will we be able to spend as well.
Thank you for that very practical mistake and learning for everyone. From there, I'm going to shift to, I'm looking at the long list of the questions, and I'm going to actually try to combine a couple of them. And maybe going from the practical to something that is more political. And I think there are two questions coming from in different forms from different participants. Suzanne Zuidema is asking a question specific to South Africa, asking, what do you think was the initial motivator for the politicians who support early childhood development in your context? Prior to their exposure to your strong business model and your data proving the value of investments in early childhood development, what is the motivator of some of the politicians trying to looking into the politics of it? And there's another question here, Michelle, the opposite of that. And I know we didn't touch on it, but I know your earlier work on the political economy of early childhood education. Let me find the question. 1 second. Yeah, it's from Umutesi Egidia. We're all aware that the brain for a child grows at 80% in the first 5 years. Why countries are not investing a lot in foundational ecosystem for children? So more about what is the politics or the political economy of not investing in early childhood education, early childhood development more broadly. Whoever would like to take that first.
I can start with just on our end how we've done it. I think one of the assets that South Africa has is we've got a very strong civil society, non-profit sector that has been creating awareness around the importance of early childhood development for quite a substantial time. So I think when, as basic education, we received the function, that was the foundation we could build on. And I think at that point, we were very fortunate by having, I think, a minister, and we had a political shift during this time as well. And the incoming minister, similarly, understood that if we don't fix the problem early on, the rest of the education sector will always suffer. So I think a very strong case was made that all our investments in our country, whether it's in education or on the social level or even on the business side, will always be less effective if we don't get this foundation right. And I think this case was made at a political level, but also with very key and I think strategic government officials in the presidency and national treasury to help with this narrative of if we really want to shift the steer in South Africa, children is where we need to start at.
Thank you, Janeli. And Michelle, over to you. Especially, I know you looked at multiple countries in your study.
Yeah, and I'll pick up some, the example from South Africa too. I mean, having a political champion, often inside the government, but sometimes outside the government, who can sort of bring together the evidence about, why investing in young children is important, both in the short term, but most importantly, for, budget purposes in the long run. And then that combined with like organized civil society or advocacy groups, and then looking for that moment in time, whether it's some sort of, a political change sometimes, like an election, or sometimes it's just sort of a broad movement. We saw COVID in itself was a crisis that sort of provided an opportunity. But these communities have to be ready to go with the information and their strategies when that window opens. So those are some of the things that I've seen from other countries as well.
Thank you. And there are two sets of questions, and that's one set that's related to demand side. So I'm going to speak to that, but also to give you a bit of time to think about it. I think several of the webinar participants are speaking to the tension around the privatization and the role of the private sector, but also public-private, the public responsibility and the public and the PPPs around it. So that's going to be a second question that I'm going to pose. But let me first come to a first set of questions that is coming from Sadashiv Nayampali, one question, and Amit Brar, another question. So Sadashiv's question is, this very encouraging to hear about the momentum being generated for ECD in South Africa. I wanted to know whether the country has explored opportunities to increase the demand side for ECD provision. Do you think mechanisms such as cash transfers, conditional could kickstart the incentives for community-based providers to provide ECD services? And because the difficulty to fund providers seems quite daunting. So one on both the demand side, but also speaking to the ECD providers and how to incentivize their work. And there's a second question speaking to the case of Jordan, but I think it's a broader question. And Michelle, I'd be curious because you mentioned the demand side opportunities for various interventions. Amit is speaking to, in Jordan, women are reluctant to send their kids to early childhood education, even if it's free and subsidized. Any examples of how such challenges were overcome in other countries would be helpful to hear. So let me start with this demand side, and then next we'll shift to this tension that's highlighted, I think at this point, 4 or 5 different comments around the public responsibilities, private presence, etc. I don't know who would like to go first. Maybe to turn things around. Michelle, could we start with you?
Sure. I think it's interesting and challenging, and it's something that pops up in many different questions in many different countries. So I think I've seen examples where before more formal preschool is established. So for example, if that starts at age 3 or 4, there might be more of like a transitional program, like a parent-child group in the community where parents can go with their children and have with a facilitator and maybe get used to the idea of children's being, socialized outside the home. And so that's something that I've seen as a kind of a way to bridge the home to the more formal school system. But I also think that, we can, there are other types of flexible programming. So in many countries, like home-based programs or community-based programs, might be more desirable than school-based. In other contexts, like the school is really what parents prioritize. So it's really about better understanding parent preferences and ideally providing a range of options that meet their needs. But in addition, we see examples of, for example, bringing in like mediators or facilitators from the community who are more like support or volunteers or sometimes assistant teachers. We've seen that a lot in Roma communities to have that linguistic and cultural sensitivity that makes the early childhood setting more welcoming to families. So that's something else that I think is very promising as an approach.
Thank you, Michelle. And Janeli, from your, you've already mentioned some demand-side models and interventions, but would love to hear a bit more on that side from the South African experience.
Yes, and I think what we're grappling with is in South Africa, we're not at a point where we can provide free early childhood education yet. We will always need a parent contribution. Well, not always, but for the foreseeable future until we've got our funding sorted out. But that means that parents need to value this enough. And I think that there's part of a piece of work that we need to do around having a societal narrative where all actors of society, especially parents, understand the importance of early childhood development and education. We're stimulating the demand, but then at the same time, I think we are very clear that we need to subsidize ECD programs better, and we will be doing that over time, making sure that all children can access, especially the poor. And how our subsidy works is the funding is paid to the ECD program, but it's a per child per day subsidy. So that only children that are eligible for the child support grant, so only poor children can benefit from the subsidy. So all poor children in South Africa should be able to access subsidized ECD programs, and we need to get that subsidy value up to a point where parent fees don't necessarily need to be a barrier anymore. But that's going to take a couple of years for us to get to that point.
Thank you. And I think that actually ties really nicely into the next set of questions that's around how do we actually ensure inclusive quality education for all children in a system that's primarily where the providers are non-state providers. So there are a couple of questions. One is from Adam Mohammed from Somalia, who's saying that in Somalia, 95% of the schools are business-oriented and charge fees that range from $5 to $150 per month to parents. And that causes dropout. So I'm guessing this is both related to primary, but also pre-primary education. How can we solve that problem? And you already spoke to the subsidy model a little, but I wonder, Michelle, if there are other examples of government supporting and providing financing instruments in either mixed delivery systems or primarily dominantly private sector delivery systems for early childhood education. And then another question is coming from Colette Byrne and saying, well done, South Africa, on raising the funds. How do you counteract the commodification of early childhood education? That being where services are viewed as a financial asset to make sure the funding actually goes to the children. And what accountability measures do you recommend if the countries are coming to a baseline of a marketized system? And I think these are kind of speaking to it. And maybe more broadly, I know, Janeli, in your presentation, you talked about your partnerships with the private sector around the PPPs and other forms of collaboration. What are the biggest challenges? Why do you think it's worth it? And how do you make them work? So whichever part of that big bundle you'd like to take, over to you. Maybe we start with Janeli this time.
Yeah. So I think what we grappled with is if we want to achieve the goal of universal access to quality ECD in the next 5 years, what's the quickest way to getting there? And what is the ultimate challenge we want to solve? And I think what we said is collectively, we want to see every child thriving by 5. And that means that we need to work collectively. So the majority, 95% of ECD programs in South Africa are what I'll call independent. I don't want to call it private necessarily, because they're not making a profit. They are women in their communities that have been stepping up and say, I'll care for children. Now, we want those children to receive access to quality care. And I think that is what we are saying as government is we need to set those quality standards and make sure that all ECD programs receive that quality. And we need to make sure that funding and fees is not a barrier to access. And those are the roles we can play as government. But then I think often the mistake that we make is we think by doing a public provision, we will solve the challenge. And that doesn't necessarily hold true, because it will take us very long to do this through a public provisioning perspective. So while I think it's always helpful to have a mixed modality and have different models that you test out and try out, I don't think a country, especially as diverse as South Africa, cannot have a one size fit all. We need to have diverse solutions for diverse communities. Again, thinking what is the pros and cons of each of these solutions.
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in
Yeah.
and say, I mean, globally, there's a strong push and to have at least 1 year of free pre-primary available for all children. I mean, that's in the SDGs. We've seen great progress towards that, not everywhere, and there's still, groups that are more that have been left behind, and that's very important to address. So, there I think we see really a strong role in government in resourcing that pre-primary year or years. And I think it's with the younger children where we see a lot more diversity. So I know we haven't really talked so much about different age groups, but often where we see a lot of the private provision and the mix and the public-private partnerships is for the younger children, so children before the pre-primary age. And I agree with Janeli. I think it is going to take a long time to get that system and the financing worked out so that fees aren't a barrier, but there are strategies that can be done in terms of providing incentives to providers that if they meet quality standards, they receive some core support. Some countries have experimented with fee caps, where you can't, if you're sort of part of this government or public-private network, that you can't raise parent fees above a certain point. Or, as I talked earlier about, within a universal system, trying to really target those resources if they're scarce, and they all usually are, to really the most, the ones who have most challenges in accessing those services. So, and it's complicated, how do you determine the thresholds and the amounts and things like that? But I think, as Janeli's also said, having what is the vision that we're trying to achieve, and then how do we sort of put it into place over time? And so if that is quality and equity and, access with targeted support, that's the direction of travel.
Thank you. And there is one last set of questions, certainly not least, and possibly the most important, that's around inclusion. So we have questions from Suzanne Zuidema, Sue Philpott, Ruth Sprengers, and also I think questions from Peter Ningetiri and Verona Queenie-Safo. The first three are asking about inclusion of children with disabilities in a meaningful way. How do we think about the financing? And how do we ensure that the financing considerations are supporting and ensuring inclusive approaches? And then the second set is a bit broader, and I leave it to you to decide. How do we think about financing when we think about reaching with quality ECE to the more vulnerable children, children living in rural communities, children with certain vulnerabilities, children affected by armed conflict? So, let me turn to, I don't know, whoever would like to go first. In this case, a very important and an extra challenging question. And maybe we close with that, with your questions to this one. But I do have one last question to Michelle before we go. I don't know who'd like to go first.
I mean, I guess I could speak broadly, and then maybe Janeli can talk about the specific case of South Africa. I mean, in my experience, and most of my recent work has been in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, this is what teachers want. This is what parents want. And I've seen a real shift in the discourse, even at the policy level, towards, the right to inclusion, which I think is really, important, but we do have a very long way to go. So I think, first of all, it needs to start well before the preschool years in terms of early intervention. I think we need to work within the health system and make sure that the health providers, including community health workers, have the skills for early identification and developmental monitoring and referrals if that's needed, and providing support to families so that they can support their children from very early on. But in terms of the early childhood education and pre-primary years, I think training is very important, and making sure that educators have the skills And, sometimes that is going to be more expensive in terms of adapting facilities or adapting other aspects of the program, and then we need to resource it accordingly. So I've seen that in terms of like grants to programs that are serving children with identified disabilities. But also, I think we talked about, if parents are reluctant to send their children, like how can you work within the community in order to better understand what these services are able to provide children from all backgrounds.
No, yeah, I think that's spot on. I think this is something we've been grappling with as well, is how do you enable the ECD practitioner to support all children in that ECD program, but also have a network of support around her when she needs help, when there's a child in a program, because we know that while it's ideal to have specific ECD programs for children with specific needs, these are really young children. You can't put them in a hostel. You can't put them, they can't travel far distances. So you really need to equip that ECD practitioner to deal with whatever child and their specific needs are. So we don't have the answer, but we've been grappling with that. But then I think specifically on the costing side as well is how do you, in our case, have a specific, a separate value for that ECD subsidy if there's a child with a unique need, so that you can support that ECD program more to help and support this child best, which opens up a whole array of other implementation questions of like how do you identify the child, how do you identify their needs, how do you account for it from an auditing perspective so people don't think you're gaming the system. A whole lot of audit questions around it, but I think these are the things we need to grapple with on how do we really ensure inclusivity at the ground level.
Thank you. And maybe before I give a proper thank you to Janeli and Michelle and shifting to section 2 of the webinar, if I could ask one final question, this time to Michelle. I know you've been working with international organizations for over a decade, producing global goods, supporting international efforts to advance national early childhood education policy agendas. So what types of global goods and efforts do we need more of? And where are the gaps that you see where we need to focus our resources and energies on?
This is my wish list. I mean, I think the first is data for sure. I think at the national level, having a better understanding of what's currently in place and how are the resources going to the services. I think this was asked in some of the chat questions as well. So I think more use of tools like public expenditure reviews that were mentioned, or public expenditure tracking surveys. All of that I think will make funding more efficient as well. So I think that's important. I think at the global level, we're seeing that many countries are not reporting to UIS, for example, on what they're spending, even on pre-primary, not let alone the whole system of early childhood, including the younger children. So that needs to be addressed as well, and better understand like what are some of the barriers to reporting at the global level so we can track progress over time. I think we need more evidence about the impact of different financing strategies. We're getting better about what countries are doing, but like what is the impact, and are there sort of trade-offs, and what. So I think more studies about that would be very helpful as well. And then finally, I think learning across countries. I think this is an area where countries are all facing challenges. Nobody's saying we have adequate resources for this, and I think there's a lot to learn. So I think bringing together countries and and subnational entities and learning within and across countries is really important in terms of financing.
Thank you for all those, especially the last one. I think we need to come together more. I'm a big fan of that. So thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Janeli, for your honest reflections and insights. And thank you to all the webinar participants for your great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I think we got to about half of them, which is great. So we'll now be moving our focus from domestic financing to the international arena. We have 3 speakers who will share with us several exciting global initiatives, technical resources, international partnerships, and financing opportunities. So we'll be starting with Rokhaya Diawara. Rokhaya is the global lead for early childhood care and education at UNESCO headquarters. And during her time at UNESCO, she's been the brain and the heart behind many of the global convenings and initiatives to mobilize broader support for early childhood education. And before joining UNESCO, Rokhaya held various roles, including as a teacher, researcher, and the coordinator of the African Working Group on ECCE. We will then turn to Melissa Kelly. Melissa is an education specialist at the World Bank, where she leads the Early Childhood Policy Academy. Prior to joining the World Bank, Melissa managed early childhood education programs at Child Fund International and Save the Children. And after Melissa, we'll turn to my dear colleague, Adriana Balducci. Adriana is the head of program development at the Education Outcomes Fund. And in this role, she oversaw the development of the outcomes partnerships for early childhood care and education in Rwanda, South Africa, and Sierra Leone. And prior to joining EOF, Adriana led a global education initiative at WISE Qatar Foundation. So thank you to all three of you for making the time to join us today. And now over to you, Rokhaya.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Ozsel. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. Thanks also to my colleagues, Michelle, and also who presented before me. Let me start by saying how pleased I am to see this course on financing and planning ECCE taking place, and especially to see the level of commitment and enthusiasm it has generated among the beneficiaries. But I also want to warmly welcome the wider audience joining this webinar today, as this conversation matters to the entire ECCE community. And I say something, and let me say something very deliberately, and we all know that already. Change starts with capacities. It starts with a strong understanding of the problem, a clear knowledge of the policy and financing bottleneck, global and national commitment and movement, and shared ability to identify concrete action needed to move forward. This is just something we all share and we all understand also in terms of introduction. In the next slide, let me start with some background information, if I may say this way. The Global ECCE report comes directly from the Tashkent Declaration adopted in 2022, which mandate UNESCO to produce final global report on ECCE. The first report, co-published with UNICEF in 2024, was already an important step in strengthening collaboration, supporting member states, and monitoring progress on the Tashkent commitment. Now we are moving to the 26th edition, which will take us further and which is really fitting in the today discussion. It will be co-published with UNICEF and the OECD, and it focuses on a question that many of us in this course deal with every day. How do we finance equitable and inclusive access to quality ECCE? And I think we started having already some very interesting information coming from South Africa, also supported by the global review shared also by Michelle. And I want to strengthen something important again about this report, which is not about identifying the gap only. It is also designed to be solution-oriented in look at innovative financing approach, a way of reaching marginalized children and undeserved age group, and how to place ECCE more in broader education and development financing debate, as was already presented by Jan in the introduction. So for ministries and colleagues, this is about evidence that can support planning and decision-making. For the wider ECCE community joining also this webinar, it is about building a strong share case for the investment. And in the next slide, I will share very quickly the framing of the report. What makes this report particularly important is a partnership around it. I already said it coming from the Tashkent Declaration, but it is also a joint effort, this second one, by UNESCO, UNICEF, and OECD, global and regional ECCE network, and other development partners. That matters because when institutions align around a shared evidence base, they create, we all know, momentum and they make it easier for countries to move from fragmented initiative to real system reform. And I think this is also something we have heard also from Ozsel in her intervention. For your information, this report itself is framed in 3 parts. One is, the first part is to look at progress on the SDG 4.2 and a broader ECCE system development. The second part will place financing at the center as a lever of our inclusion. And I think, Ozsel, you were asking, what do we need also as public good at a global level to influence also this agenda? And we can consider maybe this report is one response also, one of the response you may be waiting. In part 3, we would like to turn to strategic recommendations for governments and partners as we look forward 2030 and beyond. What I appreciate, I particularly appreciate in this framing is the fact that it does not treat financing as a technical discussion disconnected from children's rights. We have to say it very clearly. It places ECCE in a broader human right, education, and development context as a matter of social justice again. And that is important because we all know financing is never neutral. What we fund and what we do not fund reveals also our priorities. And in the next slide, thanks,
I
Diane.
apologize, Rokhaya. We are past the five-minute mark.
Yes, it's okay. The slide to show that the report is also built through a structured process: desk review, case studies, analysis, projection, synthesis, and recommendation. And you will see all the different dates also we have in our agenda to get to the launch of this global report, which is due to 20th of November. The next slide. Is also to share all the other important momentum we can build on from a UNESCO perspective, all the different events where UNESCO is coordinating and where we are planning also to talk about ECCE and particularly to move this financing agenda. And my last slide will be more now sharing with you the global momentum we are building around this global report. But it is not only for this global report. It is not the final destination. It is part of the large process leading toward the first International Financing Summit in 2027. In that route, we have already what we are calling the Rwanda event. And the Rwanda event is organized by ECDAN and UNICEF, UNESCO, WHO in May. And it will be a technical forum for consultation and discussion and presenting also some specific tools countries can take when they are working on this financing on ECCE. And there is, I think, the message I would like really to leave with you today is, if we want to scale ECCE, we cannot focus only on some aspect. We have to treat it as a system, and we must finance access, quality, inclusion, and all this rounded also by governance and policy. So whereas you are joining from a ministry, partner, institution, university, or civil society, the question for all of us is, what financing choice today will allow us to reach for most vulnerable children for tomorrow? Over to you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rokhaya, and thank you for sharing with us about the various global initiatives for building a real momentum around investing in early childhood education. They're so valuable. They're so valuable also for the civil society organizations and civil servants to leverage in their own countries to make the case for greater and better investment in early childhood education. I'll now turn to Melissa, and Melissa will be sharing about some of the many ways that the World Bank supports ministries, including via training opportunities, technical resources, and funding resources. So over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to share more about how the World Bank supports ECD and the resources available to governments, World Bank country teams, and partners, as Ozsel said. I just want to say quickly, this is an impressive session. I've seen ECD champions from over 45 countries connected today. So as you'll see on the first slide, we work with countries through either IDA financing or grants and advice to low-income countries, or IBRD financing or loans and advice to middle and some low-income countries. We also manage funds on behalf of other organizations such as GPE. And what you can see on the slide is that governments decide how to prioritize their funding allocations based on their country's strategic framework. And while ECD financing isn't easy peasy, as Ozsel said, what's exciting is that over the past 10 years, governments have increasingly prioritized ECD as part of their allocation. And the portfolio worldwide has grown from $4.6 billion to $7.3 billion. Once government has identified their priorities, the World Bank works with government to co-design projects with input from partners. Then governments implement the projects and the World Bank provides support and quality assurance. So my role on the ECD team is to support governments and World Bank teams with this quality assurance through tools and capacity building on demand-driven topics, including, as you see on the slide, quality early learning, measurement, parenting, creating a culture of reading at home, childcare, and considerations in humanitarian context. So I'll share a few examples on the next few slides and then have included more examples in an annex that you'll get after the session. So the first example is our quality early learning volume, which brings together academics and implementation experts to provide evidence and practical ideas that countries can use to strengthen the quality of early learning in low and middle income countries. There's examples from several countries in this course, and as you can see, we try to make resources available in multiple languages. Second, on childcare, we are developing a suite of tools and guidance on the next slide, including this guidance note on essential elements of quality in childcare settings. We co-launched this with UNICEF last year after consultations with many of you on the call and 15 countries. And this note provides guidance on the minimum elements of quality that can be flexibly implemented across settings, but also, as you see with the quality assurance, across systems. And I think we just mentioned a moment ago on the next slide, the importance of coming together, whether it's virtually in sessions like this or in person. And so we support policymakers both through engagements with cohorts over an 18-month period and through regional workshops with follow-up support so that they can both learn from experts as well as learning from each other to identify solutions to common challenges. And so we try to capture this learning, and you'll see several ways on the slide, including country case studies from South Africa and some of you connected here today, policymaker authored blogs on how they're approaching identifying solutions for measurement, and presentations from workshops and conferences, including a conference held last year in West Africa on strengthening childcare policies and programs. And we have self-paced courses available on 7 topics. So I've included my email on the last slide, and look forward to learning more from you and to get you these resources. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I know, Melissa, you've already said this, but in addition to the resources that were shared in the chat, we'll be sharing after the webinar some excellent resource slides that Melissa prepared, and you'll find there hyperlinks to the many resources and opportunities Melissa mentioned. So thank you again for the presentation and for preparing those slides. Very, very helpful. So now I'll turn to my dear colleague, Adriana. And Adriana will talk about the various types of support our organization, the Education Outcomes Fund, provides governments in developing and implementing outcomes partnerships for early childhood education. Over to you, Adriana.
Everyone, it's a pleasure to join this discussion. Yeah, let me briefly share our experience in using outcomes-based financing to improve education outcomes. I'm going to briefly share experiences working with the South African, Sierra Leone, Rwandan, and Namibian government. And yeah, we can continue this conversation afterwards if any of you would like to know more. So if you could go to the next slide, let me take a moment to briefly explain the outcomes-based financing model. So at the Education Outcomes Fund, we work with governments on the development implementation of outcomes funds to improve education quality at scale, particularly in contexts where systems face persistent challenges in delivering better education outcomes for children. So in our model, governments define the vision and the direction of these mechanisms, they set the fund incentives, and they co-design and co-manage implementation. The principle of an outcomes-based financing is very simple. So basically, funds committed by governments are matched by funds committed by donors. And this pooled fund is disbursed only if agreed outcomes are achieved by implementing organizations on the ground. So these outcomes about quality, child development outcomes, they're measured and assessed by an independent evaluation firm, which provides a transparent and reliable confirmation that results were achieved. And that's what's going to trigger the corresponding payments. So there are a number of implementing partners that are selected and that deliver the work on the ground. They can choose to partner with pre-financers, and these are organizations that provide upfront capital to fund the intervention, since the funds are only disbursed when results are achieved, but they also support technical systems and performance management. Given the structural challenges that remain in our early childhood education, we talked about many of this in today's conversation. We believe that outcomes-based finance becomes an interesting mechanism because it directly addresses three major system failures. Number one is inefficiency of spending by shifting attention to measurable outcomes. Number two is lack of accountability for results. Since we don't pay for activities, we're only going to pay for quality improvements, child development outcomes. And number three is lack of flexibility and innovation on the ground, which is even more important when you're talking about early childhood education, given that children's needs are so varied and a multidisciplinary approach is needed. So for us, the way we see it, and based on our experience beyond the funding mechanism, it's really about creating a new type of partnership for public service delivery, where all the partners are aligned across a shared understanding of outcomes. So we operate across different countries and levels of education system. In ECC specifically, we have 4 programs in our portfolio, 2 in implementation in South Africa and Rwanda, 1 launching in 2 weeks in Sierra Leone, and a new collaboration with the Ministry of Education in Namibia, where we've recently started designing a fund. Across the portfolio, all these governments are aiming to use financial incentives to improve quality of provision at scale, ensuring children access early learner programs regularly, but also that they are developing the foundational skills needed to transition successfully to primary school. In South Africa, Janeli explained earlier today, the program is particularly exciting because it supports the country's ambition for universal access while identifying the most cost-effective types of interventions. In Sierra Leone, we'll be incentivizing a low-cost model to expand access to rural communities by repurposing unused infrastructure and transforming them into new community-based centers. In Rwanda, it's our first program paying a higher price for children with disabilities. There are a few questions about that, ensuring that incentives are targeted toward children who need most support. And finally, in Namibia, it's impressive to see a broader system reform underway and how this mechanism can evolve into outcomes-based grants or subsidies that the government could eventually manage directly within the national system. So to conclude, outcomes-based financing is not just a mechanism, it's a way for governments to strengthen accountability, catalyze innovation, and ensure public resources are truly improving children's lives. Our experience shows that when governments lead and partners align behind clear outcomes, we can make tangible progress in scaling quality and equitable early childhood education. Feel free to send me a message if you'd like to continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adriana, and thank you to Melissa, and thank you to Rokhaya. And I think even for those of us who follow closely the global efforts around early childhood education, our speakers' presentations had many new and useful pieces of information. So I hope some of the course participants and the webinar participants will contact all 3 of you directly for more information and to explore partnerships. So I now would like to turn to Dr. GC Chang and Diane Coury for their closing remarks. And thank you, GC, for making the time to join us today. And GC is the Chief of Education Policy Section at the UNESCO headquarters. Prior to that, he was a Senior Program Specialist at UNESCO's regional office in Dakar, as well as in the UNESCO headquarters. Before joining UNESCO, GC worked in the Ministry of Education of his home country, DPR, Korea. So over to you, GC.
Thank you, Ozsel. I understand we don't have much time left. So no, I have this honor to summarize some of the discussion that we have. Great discussion and also presentation of around rich experiences from different contexts with appreciable achievements as well as lessons which appear to be also more useful takeaways. So I think all of us are aware that education system constraint facing a huge financial strain. And to different reasons, more increasingly these days, fierce competition across different development sectors, and more particularly also within the education sector. And then if we have to invest more in ECE, then we are discussing about trade-offs, and this means also at the expense of some other education levels, which should reduce their share of education expenditure. And then also we also know that there is the decline of traditional aid, and we have to also discuss about what alternatives. So the alternatives, and also what this is what we discussed and learned from South Africa and the other country experiences presented by Michelle and Elena. And then we discuss about the issues of education financing, not only in terms of its increase, but also how to allocate and for what purpose. Michelle provides some examples coming from countries, and also its spending. And South African experience presented by Janeli Kotzé has been eye-opening, including overcoming normative, organizational, and institutional barriers to increase the financing issue. So what I understand, also interpreting my learning, listening to successful stories, is about better framing of the importance of ECCE. So trying to speak the language that policymakers would like to hear, tackling the current concerns and priorities that speak to policy and decision makers in education, which such as early school leaving. This is one of the top priorities, concerns in many ministries, which leads to increased out-of-school children and also learning crisis. I think we discussed about low basic and the fundamental skills that also the minister in South Africa would like to tackle, and then which led him or her to get interest in the importance of ECE, and then also increase the disparities and exclusion, and also investment case in care sector and women's employment. This tells us that we might need to also review our investment case, perhaps going beyond the current most often repeated narratives. We know what the science tells us, science, and we are framing also is the importance of ECE for lifelong learning, and also in terms of economic returns. But we have to go beyond that, and noting that the political life of politicians, or those who are making decisions, their life is short. So they want for the solutions right now, and there is need that we might need to build our narratives linking to the current priorities that governments, especially ministries, are facing in order to see more increased support for ECCE. So there is also another lessons learned is the better integration of ECE in education policy, planning, management ecosystems. This is what Diane from IIEP also has mentioned. And also we have to address serious data gaps in ECCE, not necessarily all data, but also focusing more on priority basic data to support credible sector planning and more and better resource allocation for ECCE. and also tackling the issue of accountability through building better evidence and monitoring, and also the data for better prioritization for impact and scale. So this is some takeaways that I'm getting from listening to different presentations and discussion, and I'm so happy that there are so many people who were able to come and share great experience and the lessons learned. Over to you, George.
Thank you very much, DC. So I have the privilege to close this webinar. Before we will closing, indeed, I would like to really warmly thank everyone who contributed to today's webinar on behalf of IIEP's team. First, a very special thank you to Education Outcome Funds and especially to Ozsel for this wonderful collaboration in the co-preparation of today's session and for such helpful and engaging moderation. It has truly been a pleasure to work together on this webinar as well on the broader course on early childhood education planning. Our sincere thanks also go to all our panelists and speakers for the generosity of their contribution and for sharing such rich insights and practical experiences. And thank you all of you who has joined today. Your active participation, your questions, and your engagement have really enriched this discussion. Let me close with a few words on IIEP's work in this area. This webinar, which is part of a broader course, is also part of IIEP's wider effort to support member states in developing ECE policies that are robust, realistic, and adequately funded. We do this in several ways by supporting countries better integrate ECE into education sector analysis and plans, helping the development of dedicated ECE policies, carrying out targeted work on issues such as ECE costing and financing, and by strengthening the capacity of ministry teams. This work builds on both our earlier global MOOC on mainstreaming pre-primary education into sector plans and our new specialized course on planning for quality and equitable early childhood education, of which this webinar is one component. To learn more about our program on the foundation of education planning and other specialized courses, please visit our website. The link is also shared in the chat. A last reminder, all the materials discussed today will be shared on the event page after the session. As you have seen, some have already been shared today during the session. Thank you again to all of you, and we look forward to continuing the exchange. Goodbye, everyone.